In this lesson, we want to talk just a little bit about the English colonies that were some of the first English settlements in the New World. The very first that we're going to mention is Jamestown. Jamestown is the beginning of really the permanent English settlement on the New World. And when they first show up, the colony really struggles initially until a charismatic leader comes to the fore by the name of John Smith. John Smith was a charismatic guy, although he was not well liked, at least not initially. But after some initial struggles, the colonists finally went ahead um, and kind of submitted to his leadership because he was the only one who really grasped the seriousness of the situation where unless they decided to grow food, they weren't going to make it. And so he's the one who kind of starts to turn it around. Without him, Jamestown probably would have failed. Another thing that he realizes is that the Native Americans around them really kind of had him up against the wall. They really, if they had chosen to, could have wiped the colony out. So he goes over and flatters the Indian chief, a guy by the name of Powhatan. And Powhatan, even though he's a little uneasy, he's eventually won over by Smith, and they end up kind of helping him a little bit and letting him survive. Unfortunately for Jamestown, John Smith was injured in a hunting accident. His gunpowder that he kept on the side on his belt ignited by a stray spark, and he was pretty seriously injured, and he had to return to England. The colony also would have faltered because they really came to get wealthy. This was an economic venture, and they were looking for gold. They didn't find any. What they did find is that you could grow tobacco there, a cash crop, and this really saves the colony. All of a sudden, the people could go ahead and make a profit using the sale of tobacco, and it became known actually as brown gold. Once the colony was established and really started to thrive, people started to move away from the initial settlement, and the outskirts, a lot of your poorer frontier colonists started to settle and try to make a go of things. Out here, they didn't get along so well with the Indians. One of the settlers that was actually pretty wealthy was a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, and he leads a rebellion against Jamestown. And his basic complaint is, look, they're not helping defend these poor frontier colonists against Indian aggression, what they perceived as Indian aggression. And so he goes ahead and leads the poor frontier colonists in a rebellion against Jamestown, which is eventually put down. Uh, Again, one of the big complaints was that, hey, the poor frontier colonists weren't represented in colonial government. Lack of representation. Sound familiar? That will become a theme in the American Revolution, and you see it already cropping up early on in Jamestown. And again, Jamestown, founded for economic reasons, and again, struggling in the early going. Almost failed, except for the efforts of John Smith. Another colony, which is founded for very different reasons, is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by a group called Puritans. They were persecuted in Europe. They were not well received because they wanted to really change the church, and quite frankly, the European rulers didn't want the church to change. And so this particular group decided to come to the New World and start a colony there. So Massachusetts Bay not really started at all for economic reasons, but rather for social reasons, religious reasons. Their leader was a guy by the name of John Winthrop. He was pretty well connected back in England, and he was the one who was able to get the charter. He was a lawyer, and he becomes the governor of the colony. And he believes that Massachusetts Bay should be a city upon a hill, a light to the world about good Christian governance. So this is really, Massachusetts Bay is really about an experiment in government and religion. And so they wanted to purify religion. And they believed that everyone should experience God, so they de-emphasize religious ceremony and tradition. They have a more austere or a more simple service without as many of the ornate trappings, robes and priests and things like that. Big emphasis on personal responsibility. You know, it wasn't the priest's job to read the Bible and tell you what it was your job to read the Bible. And this is really the beginnings of what today we have as our public school system, where these folks, the Puritans, wanted to teach all their kids to read. And it really starts off more as a homeschool type of environment where the parents are teaching their kids to read, but eventually they decide, no, it would be a better use of time if all the kids got together and one person taught them how to read, so that they could go ahead and do the work that they needed to do to survive, really. And so it became more of a cooperative situation. They big emphasis on personal prayer, and a big emphasis on not relying on a priesthood. That you guys, as members of their congregation, would be relied on to go ahead and read and study the Bible for yourself. Not everybody in Massachusetts Bay, though, always agreed with this. One guy who really didn't was a guy named Roger Williams. He disagreed with some of the religious laws of Massachusetts Bay. In other words, if you went to Massachusetts Bay, you had to practice religion a certain way. He didn't think that was right, to the point where he made such a stink and such a fuss, they eventually kicked him out. He's exiled from Massachusetts Bay out into the wilderness, which sounds more or less like a death sentence. I mean, there's nobody else out there except for potentially hostile Native Americans, but he wanders in the wilderness and eventually found his own colony called Rhode Island. The town where he eventually settles, he named Providence, which today is the capital of Rhode Island. Providence, the will of God. It was the will of God that he came there. And this is really the origination of separation of church and state traditions that we still follow today, is Roger Williams, this idea that we shouldn't have laws that tell us how to practice our religion. Another dissenter was Anne Hutchinson. She taught even more radical. Not only was the priesthood not necessary, the church wasn't necessary for a relationship with God. The Puritans felt this was blasphemous, and so they went ahead and exiled her from Massachusetts Bay as well. And she goes ahead, and she will end up in Rhode Island as well. She will follow Roger Williams over. But again, Rhode Island founded for religious purposes, just like Massachusetts Bay, although slightly different. And again, Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island, unlike the colony down in Jamestown, experienced immediate success. So very different purpose and very different results. And they thrive. And really to the point where they become the wealthier colony. Boston becomes the center of the colonial world during the early time period of American history.